Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of Experts Connect at the Networking Studio. Today we have a very special guest that I've known for a while because we keep crossing paths at all these events and conferences and meetings. Mary Catherine Jones from the Audiobook Experience, formerly Voice Over Vermont. I've known Mary Catherine through IBPA, and we see each other at a lot of meetings. We've also met at the Women in Publishing Summit, if I'm not mistaken, about 2 years ago, I think.
Well,
So,
and also at the EFA.
oh, EFA, you're right. Yes, exactly. That's where we met initially, through EFA. Absolutely, at
Yep.
EFA at the conference in Alexandria.
Yep.
So, Mary Catherine is the owner and the executive producer of the Audiobook Experience, and her goal is that every author that works with her feels like they are their most important client. She owns this audiobook production company. It's a boutique company, and she loves working with indie authors to get their books into the hearts of people who read with their ears. And when I asked Mary Catherine before we brought her on today, if there's one fun thing people would never know about her, is that she sang the Mighty Mouse theme song over the PA system of an ambulance while responding to a call. Lights, sirens,
Right.
and here I come to save the day. And to
A long
I
time
asked,
ago. It wasn't recently.
it would have been fun though. If it would have been recently too, though. That would be even more entertaining. Um, And something else that we're going to talk about during this meeting is the incredible growth that the audiobook market has been experiencing. There's a lot of trends happening right now. There's a lot of opportunities for editors also in the audiobook market. And we're going to discuss all of that. So, Mary Catherine Jones, I'll pass it over to you. And I know that I read a little bit about you, but is there anything else that you'd like to add to your profile and what you want to be known for and people remember you by here as an audiobook producer?
The single most frequent kind of comment I get from the people I work with who write wonderful testimonials and all of that is that I apparently can make people feel very comfortable. And it's really important, particularly when you're working with an author who is narrating their own book. They need to feel comfortable. They need to feel literally heard, and supported. Sometimes when it's a work of memoir, you can get through some pretty difficult spots. And so being able to hold that space, is something that I love doing. I love working with authors both to cast their books. I definitely enjoy that, but when I can work with an author here in the studio, it's just like that extra bit of magic that happens. So I guess that's what I would want to share.
You can really hear that in an author's voice when they're reading. When you're listening to an audiobook, you can really hear, especially in memoir, and you're right about that, how hard some sections are or how many memories that section is triggering for the author. So yeah, absolutely. Um, I'm gonna quickly also introduce Juliet and Adrian. Do you each want to introduce yourselves to Mary Catherine and tell Mary Catherine a little bit about yourselves and what type of editors you are?
Go ahead, Julie.
And Juliet, oh yeah, Adrian, go ahead.
Okay. Um, Mary Catherine, we met at Women in Publishing this year, so this is really lovely that you came to visit us here. I am a developmental editor, line editor, proofreader, coach, and I can do copy editing. I'm trying to avoid that this year because I don't find it as pleasurable. And I work with nonfiction and fiction authors. And I've always been interested in audiobooks, but the idea of editing one seems really crazily daunting. So I'm super curious about the process.
Juliet?
Hey, I also met Mary Catherine earlier this month at the Women in Publishing Summit. So that was a lovely experience. I'm glad to be here today. So I'm in Seattle and I it's funny, if you're ever approached by someone who really wants copy editing is my happy place by far. And I sort of do proofreading and um, have thought a little more about developmental. Um, but I really enjoy copy editing, nonfiction of many types. But my primary clients are educational publishers and memoir and personal narrative writers. Um, I I'm like an audiobook Luddite. I don't listen to them myself. I don't know anything about the world. I am just so curious to learn. I also can't imagine what editing an audiobook really means. So yeah, looking forward to being enlightened.
Excellent. I think you're in the right place, Julia, because this is a place to like learn and ask questions as usual. So,
Yeah.
Mary Catherine, so one of the things that blew me away that I read recently, and I think it was an article in Publishers Weekly, is how much audiobook sales have increased, not only in the last decade, but in the last 2 years, 3 years. It seems like things have skyrocketed. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
So audiobooks have grown. I don't have my chart in front of me, but I want to say it's double-digit growth for the last 12 years, with the exception of the last two, where it was like 9 and 9.5%. But basically, at the end of 2023, which is the last year that we have the data for as published by the Audio Publishers Association, the audiobook industry was 1,980,000,000 was where it was. As of 2024, the initial numbers, not yet vetted, is we're now up to 2 billion. But what's really crazy is that actual people in the actual industry are projecting that by the end of 2030, it's going to be 30 billion. I don't really understand how we go from 2 billion to 30 billion in 4 or 5 years. I'm like, maybe there's a typo, but like that is actually what's out there published. So that, even if there is a typo, that's a lot of growth. And so there's a lot of opportunity as people are getting their books into audio. What I'm seeing is that most, not all, but most people, when they're kind of serious about publishing, they're publishing their print version, they're publishing their e-version, and they're doing the audiobook. The audiobook is a significant investment, but it can provide, it will provide a return. Whether it will provide a huge return, it's going to depend on the sales of the book itself. So,
And I think the return, because I've been wanting to do my audiobook for a long time, and I
yes,
go and I oscillate. I'm ready. I'm not ready. Yes, and so it's been about 3 years. I think we've been wanting to do networking for freelance editors and audiobook, and networking for writers, and we'll get there. But I think the investment into the audiobook is comparable. It's the same experience as the investment in the paperback or the ebook, because there's a cost associated, and it's just going to take a long time to recuperate. However, when you're a prepared author and you're prepared to do the work that you have to do to promote your book, and it's just not only putting it up on Amazon or any of the platforms, there's so much more to it. Having the book available in the three formats, in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. Hardcover is an easy thing, like there's not a lot of change there, only on the cover. So just having that available to everyone at the same time, I think, is a huge benefit. But it is a big investment, but it's the same as with books. It's an investment that you have to make, and you're going to have a return eventually. You just have to make sure that you plan it out and that you're patient, that it's not going to be overnight. And from
right.
what I see in audiobooks, and what people don't know, is because it's kind of like ebooks. It's a one-time file that's digital, that you just have to move around to different platforms to post it, to make it available. It's so much easier than having a paperback when you're trying to, because the paperback has to be printed. There's paper involved. There's a production process that's more physical, hands-on. The audiobook is a lot more, it's hands-on, but it's all digital. And it's just easier to move around different platforms, I think, than the paperback is. So I think there is a huge advantage to that. And I think that growth might be related to technology becoming more available to certain audiences in different countries?
Well,
Or as
it's
markets
that,
open? Yeah,
it's also that because we were talking about this in the presentation I shared with you, that the distribution platforms, what that means is that there are more options for people to access the audiobooks. So like it within the greatest area of growth within the audiobook sector in the United States is through the library markets, right? And so because people are like, oh, I love Libby because it's awesome. And so that's been like a gateway for people too, to be like, oh, I actually like listening to audiobooks. So Libby would be a platform. Of course, there's Audible, right? So people know about Audible and they're like, oh, maybe I'll get an audiobook. But then one of the disruptors, if you will, has been Spotify, because
that's
now
incredible.
add in, where they can, for an extra $9 a month or whatever, you can listen to up to 15 hours of audio. And I know for a fact that that is the only reason that one particular consumer now listens to audiobooks, and that's my husband. It's only because he already had Spotify and he was like, oh, well, I can do this and it'll roll over and all of that. And if my husband is now listening to audiobooks and he never did before, even though he loves me, I know that Spotify is a big factor of that.
Yeah, and so when I think about audiobook consumption, and we've talked about this, like why are we talking about audiobook consumption if we're editors? And one of the things that we discuss a lot at the networking studio and between us is that we can't hold ourselves into editing and copy editing words. We have to think about how the market works on the back end so that we can figure out where we fit into that and where are the opportunities for us. So the more that we know about these different platforms, I think the better informed we are as to whether we'd like to try something new or offer a new service or not offer a new service. But for me, my audiobook, I was against the Kindle when it came out. I was like, no, I like real books. And it took me a long time, I would say at least 10 years, to buy into the Kindle idea and having an ebook. And I do now, and I do only for when I travel, because I still like paperbacks and I still like paperbacks. Audiobooks, though, I've discovered Libby. But what I like about the audiobook is that I only listen to business audiobooks. I've tried other genres and it's just not for me. But I will listen to business audiobooks at like 1.25 speed or 1.5 speed. So I can get through a business audiobook that a paperback would have taken me maybe 3 weeks. I can get through it maybe in 5 days in the
And you can
morning.
do it while you're driving. You can do it while you're, like waiting in the car, kids playing soccer, I think you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so my reading consumption has increased, if you will, through audiobooks. And so now I see it as a tool for me as a business owner, just like it's another tool in my toolkit of how to get information fast and much perhaps more reliable or vetted than it might be on a blog that somebody writes something. So I think it's just another great way, another learning tool that we have. So when I approached you was because I got invited by Penguin Random House to edit an audiobook maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it was nonfiction. I had never done this work before. Somebody from EFA had referred me because they needed someone who spoke Spanish or understood Spanish, and I was sent I didn't know the first thing about it, but I was like, tell me what you would like me to do. And they hired me to do a developmental edit on the book, which I thought was really surprising. So they had the paperback copy that had done really well, and they wanted to turn it into an audiobook, but because the paperback was about 10 years old, they wanted to shorten it. And they wanted to know what could they eliminate that wasn't needed in the book so that they could have a shorter book and put it into audiobook format. So my role was as a dev editor to kind of remove the things that I felt weren't necessary. And there was a lot of stuff that was removed. And then from there, I got hired to copy edit the audiobook, but it had already been, by the second time it came back to me, it had already been laid out in a Word document, and it was different than what I had sent them the first time, which is a marked up Word document, double spaced with comments. This had been, the font was larger. It was like 2 or 3 times larger. There were some sections in red. It was broken down into much shorter paragraphs. And I could just tell that they didn't tell me this was, they didn't give me any indication, but I was just supposed to copy edit and make sure that everything was consistent. So the document size itself was much longer because the formatting had been changed to meet the audiobook need. And they told me specifically this is going to be read on an iPad, which is why. And so can you tell us a little bit about, I know that you're not an audiobook editor. I'm going to preface that by saying, because you're the producer, but when the audiobook comes to you, or when someone says they want to do an audiobook, what are the steps? How do they go from that manuscript that they have in a Word document or a PDF to get it to behind the microphone ready to read?
So it's a complicated answer. So first of all, I want to clarify the term audiobook editor, because it's going to mean different things depending on who you're talking to. If you come to me and say, I want to be an audiobook editor, I'm going to say, that's great. Here are all the raw wave sessions, and I just need you to clean this up and get it ready for mastering, and we'll upload it to Audible. That's working with sound files. That's what an audio editor is to me.
Mm-hmm.
But it might mean something different within the editorial community. I would think of it more as somebody who adapts print books for audio, right? But I don't know exactly how it's referred to. So I just wanted to clarify that. And I think that there is, as with everything, there is certainly a difference between how Penguin Random House may approach a project versus independent author, hybrid publisher, that kind of thing, which is going to be a lot more, it's not going to have that level of production coming into it. So what you were describing, Linda, is obviously coming from a bigger house. What they're taking into consideration is that this is going to be read, like you said, on an iPad. And so you don't want to have font that is unreadable, and that is too small for the author. When I work with authors, and they're almost all indie authors at one level or another, what I get is the PDF of the manuscript. And I share that on the iPad. I literally just this year, I have sort of like your standard iPad, and I had one for the studio as well. And I just ponied up for the big one because I just felt so bad that it was hard. It was harder to read. I always have it turned on its side so that it's that much bigger, right? When it used to be that I would get the PDF, and then I would transfer it, and I would export it to Word, and then I would increase the font, and then I would reduce it again to a PDF. And it ended up, how things get wonky whenever that happens, and it ended up being more trouble than it's worth, and it's just better if they squint for a few days. But if you have the software and the love in your heart to, get it up to a good 16 points, that's a real favor for everyone. The downside for that is that when you're talking, like if the narrator's recording and we find a mistake, and I circle it, and it's like, oh, on page 234 there's this thing. Okay, well, which page 234?
Yeah.
So that's a long way of saying I usually don't work with manuscripts that have been adapted in that way specifically for the author to have IEs. When you were talking about the words are underlined or in red or something, what they've done is they've actually gone through they're almost doing a screenplay type of look at it, so that they're saying, make sure you emphasize this word, you do that. When professional narrators are working with a manuscript, that is exactly what they do. When I'm working with authors to prepare them for their recording session, we will talk about that ahead of time, but I'm not preparing the screenplay version. I am relying on them to deliver in their own way the best version of what they have to say. If they sound disconnected from the text or bored, or they make mistakes or something, then I'm going to stop them and we're going to re-record it. So when we talk about what I think about, and I am not an editor, I do not know your industry. So this is kind of my idea of a hole that exists that you all might be able to fill as an add-on service. if you've got someone you're working with, let's say it's a thought leader and they're doing their book on leadership and there's charts and there's graphs and there's all that kind of thing. If you say in advance as you start working with them, are you thinking about an audiobook? Then first of all, that starts the conversation. Oh, well, I hadn't thought about it, or yes, but that's down the line, or what have you. Then you can say, well, if you are considering it, I see you've got these great graphs and all that kind of thing. Let's just think about how we would adapt that for an audiobook. And oh, I hadn't really thought about that. And so depending on what the project is, that's an opportunity, I think, for an editor just to say, this is, I can for a certain fee, I can create a minimal adaptation for the audiobook. I mean, all the way from, the printed version of my memoir has many personal photographs and, places that I lived, and I hope you go to my website to learn more. Like, that's literally, like, that would be one thing, just like make sure that's said, and you probably wouldn't charge for it, to having much more descriptive descriptions of those charts and graphs, of maybe adapting different textual ways of, the conversational dialogue, so that it's clear who is speaking, especially if it's going to be a non-professional narrator. You're going to want to have those dialogue tags in there. You're also preparing for the audiobook can include having a glossary of sorts of how to pronounce place names, whether that's a work of fiction or nonfiction. If it's a fantasy world, how does the author want that pronounced? And can you help them prepare that document so that eventually the narrator that they're going to work with will know how to pronounce those names? And that's not something that then has to be done. If I get a project like that, then I'm like, okay, now we have to do this. And it's not something I charge for, because it's because it's not. But if that were baked in, that would be a service, definitely to provide. I work with a lot of authors who write memoirs about their travels, which is wonderful. And there are so many who don't realize that they don't know how to pronounce place names until they get into the booth. And that can really slow things down. I mean, I now have a whole series of documents in advance, like, this is what you got to do, and here's the resources.
You gave me one specific example the other day when we talked, I believe, on Monday about Charlotte, I think.
Oh, right. So when one of the questions that I ask of authors, again, whether they're going to read it or if they're having somebody else, is, do you have specific pronunciations of place names that are going to be important to your story? And so I live in Vermont. I live in the town of Shelburne, and literally my driveway abuts the town of Charlotte, which most people would say Charlotte. But if you're here, it's Charlotte, and people will know that. It's just like those inconsistencies in books where they're like, there's one book in particular that took place at my alma mater, and the author was lazy. And I hate that author now because I'm like, no, graduations never happened at Rockefeller. Never once in the history of the college. And this was, it wasn't supposed to be like some fantasy thing. So I was just like, you're lazy. I'm not interested anymore. So it's that kind of thing. You want to make sure that.
So I get that a lot with audiobooks when there's words in Spanish that I just cringe when I hear the pronunciation. I'm like, no, don't say it like that. Like, ah. But I also understand, like, I'm like, oh, what's the what's the best you can do, or what's acceptable, or what's, so it's a fine line. But I really like what I'm getting from what you're saying is there's a really good opportunity to first drop the seed of, will this become eventually an audiobook? And if if you are thinking about an audiobook, I can help you adapt it. And
Yes.
that, I think that the word not editor anymore, like, you're right, it's not so much about editing, but there will be editing involved, but you're adapting the book to be heard on a different platform, and that requires some changes and some things. It's a lot of times when we talk about accessibility and editing, that is this book accessible to everyone, and we're thinking about contrast and font size, and we're thinking about how are the graphics legible if someone has a visual impairment? So we're thinking about those things when we're doing books, and it's the same thing. It's even heightened more with audiobooks. I have one of the handouts that you shared with me yesterday. I was wondering if I could just share the
Please,
graphic of the pyramid, because that really like blew my mind in terms of what I loved about it is that it made me think I needed to think differently. And I forget that sometimes with certain projects you have to think differently. So if it's okay, I'm going to share this top part because I feel this was really helpful as an editor. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay. So can everybody see the PDF that I have? Yes. So do you want to tell us a little bit about this one?
Well, so basically what these are examples that I come across all the time. And so I have to adapt this, with the author, but kind of on the fly. We get to a page and like, oh, here's a pyramid. And how are they going to talk about that? And so, like, for example, there's some text that I came up with which describes very well what the image is. So imagine a pyramid. The bottom third, the base, is the company culture. The middle third, built on top of the company culture base, is employee experience, and et cetera. So we've created a visual, and we've created a verbal description of the visual that is there. And that is, so for something like this, that was easy to do, and it helped the end consumer stay within the audiobook experience and continue to gain the knowledge that they're seeking by listening to this audiobook. Sometimes you can't do that when you have really complicated graphics. That's when, at the beginning of the book or the beginning of a section or both, you can say, there are some more complicated, not complicated, but, I have a wonderful graphic that that really illustrates what I'm talking about. You can find this on my website. And that's all you can do. You can't, there's some things you just can't adapt, but knowing where you're going to drop that in, and literally having on the page those words, because even though it's pretty simple, and now I do it all the time, so I can kind of come up with something on the fly, but you're in the booth, you're doing something you haven't done before. You're like, what was the word again? So to have it there is a kindness to the
It has to be, yeah, it really has to be spelled out. Absolutely. Here's another one that you had at the bottom of the page, which I really liked as well.
Right.
It's so again, like, it's a no-brainer, but it has to be written out. It has to be spelled out for sure.
Yes. So because you do have some of these books that do have long lists, which are great when you're reading, but not great when you're like reading it out loud. So you just want to have these shortcuts. Linda, you also mentioned that you had a book that had been adapted and shortened, for audio. And it used to be, back, 30 years ago, a lot of fiction was abridged, right? So that would have been an opportunity. I would say these days that rarely happens, but there may be some longer scholarly works that, that one might want to adapt for audio and shorten, for that purpose. So I could see that being an opportunity. I don't have anything specific in mind, but
yeah,
just like in, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that just like in publishing, so much is going to be driven by page count. In the audiobook world, it's word count. And so every word costs something. And so if you're eliminating chapters, you can be saving, a few $100s or $1,000, depending on how much you're taking out. So that would be something, there might be some projects where that would be one way to approach it.
My comment was in the B. So one of the things that I do when I approach an editing project, especially a book that I really want to get, or I want that, to take on that client. And I'm maybe concerned that I don't know if they're going to be willing to pay the fee of what's required to do the work, is I took a class, and I always mention this class, with Hester Higdon through the Chartered Institute of Editing and Proofreading. And she teaches you how to analyze a project before you even have a contract, so that you know what work is going to be involved. But what I end up doing is I use this spreadsheet that has all this data of what I've analyzed about the book, the manuscript that they're pitching to me to work on. So I'll do a breakdown by, chapters, how many images, how many footnotes, how many references. And I feel like now I would love to add there an audiobook column to say, like, does this chapter need to be adapted, for audiobook? Are there graphics that need to be, audiobook adaptation on this chapter? Yes or no? To kind of say like, oh, she knows about this. What does that mean, audiobook adaptation? And just to drop the seed and say like, hey, if this is going to be an audiobook eventually. And I think, Julia, for you, that you do so many academic things too, that there's so many graphics and charts and data things that get just shown visually. This, if there is going to be an audiobook version, it will need to be translated. It's kind of like translating medical documents into plain English. It's, I think, translating that document into audiobook format. So again, you're an audiobook producer, but you're also an IBPN member. So you've met a lot of indie publishers, you've met a lot of author publishers. What do you think, if you were to work with a new client that has never done an audiobook and it's not in good shape yet to start to be an audiobook, at what point does the editor, what can an editor do for that client besides adapting these things so that when it gets to you, the manuscript is ready to go and ready to read? Like how could an editor help you, I guess, is my question.
I'm trying to think of how to answer that, because I always, when an author comes to work with me, generally the book is ready for audio for the most part. What the biggest stumbling blocks that we get to is really oh, I hadn't thought about the graphs and charts. Oh, I hadn't thought about, if we want to address the images in some way, shape, or form. Oh, I hadn't thought about the pronunciation of these names. There's one biography that I did, and the son was paying for the biography, and there was a large list. Well, basically, there were so many people within the biography that are still alive and that are still important and all that kind of stuff, and he didn't know how to pronounce them. And it was like, oh my, I mean, so there was a whole lot of work that we had to put into, because I was also working with a narrator. So I had to be this sort of go-between, and we had to do some research and run it again by the author and make sure that that was as right as it can be. But so the place names, whether it's for, fiction or nonfiction, that's really important, as well as people. It's really important to pronounce people's names correctly. And even names that can be pronounced different ways. Is it Marianne or Marion? And sometimes an author hasn't thought of it. I was actually having a conversation with one of my authors recently who had 3 characters in her book. One was Catherine with a C. One was like Kayla with a K. And one was, what was it? Like, it was Chara, I think, or Charo, something like that. No, it was because it was another K sound. So it was like Caro,
Yeah,
but it
it
was
could be like a
spelled
Chiara, maybe. In
exactly.
Italian, Chiara is Chiara. So yeah.
And so that was something, whereas, for her, visually on the page, you've got like, different letters, different combinations, and so it's very clear. But for a narrator, it's a lot of k, k, k. And so all these characters are starting with k, 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 which might make it confusing for the end listener to keep the characters straight. And so that's just, and again, that's not like you need to necessarily rewrite it, but it's something you can say, this might cause some oral confusion when somebody is listening, because you don't think about that on
And I
the
think that you can even bring that back to like the previous copy editing stage when you get hired, or a developmental edit, to be able to say like, these are great names, but if this goes to audiobook, you might have too many names that start with the same pronunciation. I think that's a really great red flag to bring up that editors were probably not thinking about right now. And I wrote down all proper nouns. Like, how do we pronounce proper nouns? And Julia, you made a really good comment in the chat that, so Catherine, when we copy edit manuscripts, the copy editor will prepare what's called a style sheet. where we put in, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but where we put in all the rules and style decisions that have been made. So, the way punctuation is handled, when do we, how the ellipsis is done. And at the end of this style sheet, which can be, fairly long depending on the project, we have a list of all the proper nouns in alphabetical order, showing the ones that may cause spelling confusion so that they're spelled consistently throughout the manuscript. So the spelling of Charlotte is picked, and then it's in the style sheet. It says that every time Charlotte shows up on the page for this book, it is written this way.
Yeah.
And I can see, like Julia was saying, that we could add even the pronunciation of that. So the audiobook editor, if an editor were to work with an audiobook, they could take that style sheet and adapt it for audiobook production, so that by the time it gets to you and the author, you already have a document that everything's been lined out, like how things are pronounced, because it's based off of that style sheet. So I think that's a really great idea. One thing that I noticed when I listen to audiobooks is, so the book has the front matter, the body of the book, and the back matter. The front matter is most of the time read completely, so except the copyright page. There's like a little bit of copyright, then there's the dedication, then there's a prologue. But the back matter is rarely read. So is there a choice of like what part of the back matter gets included in? Because you can't, like, of course, appendices and worksheets and stuff like that maybe you can't do that. That's, you refer to the website, but of the back matter, what do you usually include in an audiobook?
That's a conversation that I have with every author, and it ends up being the author's choice. If the author says, I want to include all the footnotes, I'll say, I mean, okay, but you're adding significant cost, and I don't know that you're going to get much benefit from that. And so you have that conversation. One of the things, if sometimes, generally, I say I don't know that acknowledgments are part of what you need to include here, particularly if you have them, and you've got them in the written book. You don't need to thank your editor and all of that. You can. However, in memoir, sometimes there are particular people that they want to thank, and this is part of their life, and so they're going to do it, and which is fine. But those are the things for them to be thinking about. And if they are going to be speaking those, does that change who they're acknowledging or who they're thanking? I was just working with a gentleman doing his memoir, and he had, a page and a half of acknowledgments. What was important for him was to acknowledge the contributions of his family. And so we made some edits and did that. But those are, again, we're not talking about a heavy lift, but it's just it's more of the thought process and the thoughtfulness going into it. And hopefully that giving, for the people, that the authors you work with, that sense of, I'm working with somebody who's really thinking about all the different things I need to be thinking about, and preparing me for that. So I think that is hopefully a good opportunity. Again, it's about providing that service so that they don't have to make those decisions as they're here, or, in someone's recording studio. I don't charge anything when people come to Vermont. I don't charge by the studio hour, right? I've given them a quote, and if we do it in 3 days, great. And if it takes 4 days, that's fine. We built it into the price. It's all good. But if you are literally walking into a recording studio and the clock starts ticking, and now you're like, oh, I have to, what am I going to do with this image?
Yeah, that's not the time for that. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I know, because we've talked about us doing the audiobooks so many times, is that Mary Catherine works with a lot of studios across the US, so that if clients can't come to Vermont to record at her studio, she can hook you up with a local studio, or she can hook it with a local studio, and she'll tell the studio what are the parameters of the project that she needs. They'll record it, and then they'll send her the files, and she'll produce it in-house.
Almost. That is, I do that, but only when I'm also directing, right? so that I am part. I don't just do post-production. I need to
Right,
like
right.
I need to be there for the whole recording. Like that's part of the magic. And but so everything else is absolutely correct. I do work with studios across the country. If somebody can't come here, then we can make that work.
Because what I'm thinking when I wonder about where are the opportunities for editors, then maybe that's another, if you know, to tap in locally with audiobook recording studios that might be in your, like not you, but like for us, like now that I'm in Northern California, I might want to look up to which are the audiobook recording studios in the area, or I might ask you, Mary Catherine, do you know any audiobooks in the area that I could reach out to and ask to be in their editor freelancer pool to adapt any nonfiction books they might have for their clients?
I think I think that's an interesting. I think it's worth exploring. Because I don't know the ins and outs of how every recording studio works.
Yeah.
My my general impression is that an author's going to call up and say, I want to record. They're going to be like, great, come in, and they book the time, and all right, clock's ticking, let's do it. And but they're they're unlikely to be taking a look at the manuscript and saying, oh, I'm seeing
I
some
see.
potential problems here, and you really might want to do some work adapting it in advance. By your talking with them and you say, do you ever have authors that come in and the book's just not quite ready for audio? And they'll probably say, yeah. Then you could say, well, would it be helpful if they had a resource like me,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
to refer them to? And so I think you could do that. It's really going to depend,
Yeah, yeah. I have a couple of ideas marinating in my head, and I'll talk about it with Julia and with Adrian afterwards. Mary Catherine, I know that you're short on time. Do you, Julia and Adrian, do you have any questions for her today?
please ask me anything.
I don't have a direct question right this second, but everything you're saying is really applicable to what I'm doing right now, and that's a developmental edit on a sci-fi novel. And I had already put in the revision letter, and I'm not done reading yet, but I kind of started ideas for the revision letter that if someone were reading this to someone else, they would be a little bit lost. And so it's super helpful, and I'm really going to hone in on that in what he needs to revise in terms of if someone were just reading you this story, they would be having a hard time following this particular sequence of events. And so, framing it, because he wants an audiobook, he wants this to be a movie. He's got these
Dreams.
and so he's eager and excited and willing. He's one of those writers who's willing to listen to
Good, yeah.
anything. And then if you frame it in terms of this could kibosh one of your dreams, he's going to be so on it. And so I really, this is great. It just reinforces that, kind of what I was thinking with him was good.
I think that is good. Another tip, I don't know if it's something that you could do or not, but what I'll do, like especially with fantasy, is I encourage the author to identify, all the different worlds and names and all of that, and actually just read them. Like send me a voice recording. So helpful. It is
Yeah.
really helpful. And I wanted to mention a tool that you all could use, like for me, because I've priced it like we're done. I'm not going to go through in advance and find all these names and all of that. I have to put that on the author because otherwise I would have to charge a whole lot more.
Exactly.
But there are tools. Positron is one. Have you all heard of Positron?
What is that?
Positron, it's Pozotron, I think. And it's an audiobook. It's for audiobook people. It's in there, but there are ways you can use it sort of as a one-off where it's got all these amazing tools. So if you put in a manuscript and then you before anybody records a thing, you can say identify basically unknown words or words that might be a challenge, words that might be unfamiliar to the average layperson, and it just spits
Oh, I
it out.
love that.
Oh,
That's
it
awesome.
is, it can be very, very helpful. And it's designed as a tool for narrators so that as they're prepping, instead of like reading and then coming across an unfamiliar word, they'll go through and it does all these things. So it'll identify the words that might be in trouble. And you as an editor or as a narrator, you're like, I know that, know that, know that. So you just like get rid of, half of them. And then there's ones like, oh, I don't know what that is. And so you can click on the Merriam-Webster dictionary and hear how it is pronounced. And there's different versions of that where, it might be in different dictionaries. And so it has those tools, but of course for imaginary worlds, it's not. And so, but there's an opportunity for either the narrator or the author to upload a voice file so that if the character appears on page 2 and not again until page 370, they can go back. Oh, right, that's how I pronounce that name.
Love that. That's great. Julia?
Well, I've had many thoughts swirling around. This has been very interesting. So when talking about graphics and images, I sort of immediately thought of alt text and the similarities and differences there, because that's something that can come up in editing and also even just with social media marketing and things. So I guess I'm curious to what extent um, accessibility is taken into consideration with this process. Like with, you know, if in an audiobook, which may be listened to by someone with low vision or, vision impairment, if they hear, the blurb about some list or image and that they can go look at it on the author's website. I
Yeah,
don't know.
that's not
I'm
helping
just
them, is it?
right. Yeah. I mean, they could perhaps if they go to the website, then they can use their screen reader. I'm just curious, like I hope I'm not being too picky or something, or devil's advocate for like a clunky reading. I'm just curious if that's come up for you or
That has only come up for me um, in the context of, and it's not work that I do, but in the context of children's literature that has a lot more reliance on the images on the screen. And there's an entire burgeoning, it's still kind of nascent, but industry for it. Basically, it's called audio description, which I think is sort of like your alt text, but very much in the vein of the audio description that can be available for movies, right? For people with low vision. And so that's a whole different level of adaptation, obviously. I imagine you could apply it to graphics and all of that, but I can more readily understand how one might do that in the context of the children's books and being able to set the scene so that it is accessible to somebody who's not able to see it. But that's also one reason why I don't do picture books, because I don't think that there is the value, even if an author's like, no, 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 I really want to like, do my 20-page book. Like it's a lot to just have the text,
Yeah.
Um,
I
so
think
I
I
never
think
even thought about, picture books.
Yeah. Another thing
That is a whole nother thing.
is, and this again, we are now talking more about, it's almost a screenplay, but it's like a hybrid. I'm working on this right now, so that's why it's in my mind, but um, an adaptation of a graphic novel,
I
and
was
that
just gonna mention,
is
how that would work.
another opportunity, possibly. Like, have you thought about an audiobook? I In my opinion, if you're going to adapt a graphic novel, I think that it is going to require it to have more of like a film treatment, a screenplay
Yep.
treatment, you're probably going to want to have multiple voice actors. You may want to have some sound effects.
Mm,
You might need to create the character, like the one I'm working on right now. They created the character of the narrator for that purpose. Like the narrator's like, so now we're back on the farm, and here comes, old
Yeah.
Farmer Jones or whatever it is. And so using that as a construct to facilitate the storytelling. I mean, which I think is really cool. Like you could definitely do stuff with that. I know that to create multicast and all of that, it's a lot of money to create the audiobook of that. But
Yeah.
right.
but if that is something like in a fantasy, right, then that could be another opportunity to get involved. So if you were, Adrian, if you were adapting, if your person wanted a multicast version of his fantasy novel, then you might say, okay, we need to start looking at this a little more like a screenplay, not really a screenplay, but there used to be, well, there still is, like in the elementary schools, readers theater, where you could, you take like a fairy tale
Yep.
and turn it into a play. So it's sort of like that, um, but
Yeah.
doing it for, on a much larger level where you still have the exposition and all of that. But you like when you have multi characters, you don't want someone saying, "I love you," he said, you know, right?
Yeah, Mary Catherine, that reminded me the conversation that Julia, what you were saying too, of Katie and Orby. Leslie Nielsen there was this cartoon, I think it was like in the 90s, that Leslie Nielsen would narrate. And I would watch it with my sister just because it was Leslie Nielsen. And he was such a phenomenal narrator. And Katie and
Hmm.
Orby never spoke. They all spoke through the narrator, which was him, and they would, the narrator would talk with them, but it was always him. So I put the link to YouTube there because it was just really well done. And again, like you could just probably listen to it and imagine everything. But Julia, going back to what you were saying, accessibility, one of the things that Brittany and I, with the audiobook version that we want to do, is that, and I see this a lot in the business books that I read, a lot of them will refer you back to the website. Oh, next, coming on the next chapter, you'll find the worksheet that you can download from the website. Two thoughts about that. One is that if this is a library book, you're not always able
Mm,
to download that PDF. So it's not
hmm.
available. So you have to buy the audiobook to be able to download sometimes these worksheets. So with library books, those resources, if they're embedded within the audiobook or part of the audiobook, you don't have access to that. So sometimes the authors will put the worksheets or the things that you're supposed to download on their website, and sometimes it's part of the book, or the book gives you a code when you buy the book, so it's harder to get. But for us, what we ended up doing were that all the worksheets had initially in the first edition of the book, they were all images. So it was a worksheet that was created as an image and put in the book. The problem with
Uh-huh.
that is that a screen reader won't read the
Yeah.
image. And so it wouldn't read like name, line, date, line, description of your services line. So then we had the images, and then we had to translate that into a PDF that could be read by a screen reader. And then we went the extra level of adding a transcript of the form so that you knew what was going to be there. So there's like all these multi layers, of work that have to be done on the back end to make sure that any kind of, I think, a regular book has to be accessible, but then even the audiobook, because we will be referring to, like, you can download this from the website. Okay, they have to be on the website, but there has to be a screen reader version available of the sheets so that they're not only downloading something, but something that's actually their computers are going to be able to read, and they're going to be able to have the same experience as someone that doesn't have a visual impairment. So yeah, there's definitely, I think, room for accessibility, but I think there are tools out there right now that we can use as editors to make these books more accessible. It's just knowing about them. And it's not stuff that we have to do all the time. It's just knowing about who to refer them to get some of this stuff done as well. So,
And speaking of that, let
yeah,
me just, like, if I can.
please.
So
Yes.
if you're working with someone who's interested in an audiobook, I would love to talk with them. And if you can set up an email introduction or something like that, and we end up working together, then I am delighted to pay you all a referral fee. And so if I'm working with the author directly, then that's 10% of that if they come here to record in Vermont. And if I'm casting for them and I end up hiring a narrator, then it's a 5% fee. And I encourage, like, if you've got people you're thinking about, but you need to know more, because like not everybody's going to be the right fit, and I totally get that. But I'm like, set up a call. Like I can explain like my rates, my process, the whole thing, because I know that when you're referring somebody, you're putting your trust in, you're transferring your trust to your client, to me. And I want you to feel really comfortable with that. And if they have questions that you can answer in advance, then that's even better, right? So I'm happy to do that, and would
Can you
love
put your email address, Mary Catherine, in the chat too, so we can save it there?
Absolutely.
And yeah, and I mean, I've bogged you with questions about audiobooks for our books so many times, and you've always been so graceful and made so many great recommendations. So yeah, I can highly vouch.
Thank you.
Work
Well,
that
I
you're
do. I
doing.
really, what's important for me is that I can't type and talk at the same time.
Or I have it too. I can also I can also add it.
But if I can help, I'm going to help. I mean, that's really it. And I was contacted by an author just a few weeks ago. Turns out that she's half an hour down the road and she couldn't figure out how to record into Substack. That is not a service that I provide. It's not anything. It was just she didn't know how to get her microphone like to be recognized. So she came over. We had tea. We had a lovely time. Like, I mean, I had time, so I was able to give. I mean, now I have a friend. It's great.
Yeah.
And she promised me she's gonna take me to a really great muffin store when I come visit her. And we'll work for muffins, apparently. But if I think, like a lot of us, we're in this for getting the stories out, working with authors, and just really wanting them to succeed. And that's really what I want to do.
No.